Hey everybody, hope that you're doing well, and it was good to meet everybody yesterday. Um, I know it was a little chaotic at the start, but with all the room shifts and technology and blah blah blah, but it was good just to sort of spend a little time in the room, get to know each other a little bit, hear each other's voices, and hear each other's ideas and projects. So on top of that, all the work that's happening online is wonderful. Actually, it's great. I wanted to take some time, and I want to get right to it. Um, I guess I've decided that I'm probably going to record a sort of little video reflection, I guess you would say, not so much a lecture. Um, I'm trying to think of the best way to sort of collect our ideas and all the stuff that's floating around. And obviously, I can't collect all those ideas, but just so many things that you guys have been doing in the strategies wiki, the keyword wiki, your exchanges, the things that you said in class, all those things are things that sort of have got my mind racing. Okay, there's my cat right in front of me. Uh, those are all things that have got my mind racing, and so I just want to bring up 5 different things that I sort of took away from. I got to get my cat to stop messing with me. Uh, 5 different things that I sort of took away from our discussions in our first meeting and our online discussions and our discussion in class. The first thing was the whole concept of that first module, which, as of today, our class has been together for a week, and we've done quite a bit of work. And the whole concept of that first module, if you remember, it was hero plus genius equals myth. And the idea was this kind of notion of the death of the individual, some of which we got out of that, and a lot of you noticed this and picked up on it out of the Clapp article, but also even out of the Ken Robinson um, documentary, or the little video about education. So a couple of things, I'm going to sort of bring up 5 concepts that have been floating in my head, sort of 5 takeaways that I see in reflecting upon the work we've done over the past week. Number one is this myth and death of the individual. For starters, I mean, so many of you brought up so many interesting things in relation to that, but Rachel in particular, in relation to the Ken Robinson video, The Changing Educational Paradigms, brought up at moment 330 the quote that many brilliant people think they're not because they've judged against this particular view of the mind. This model has caused chaos in many people's lives. And Rachel was referring to this breakdown that Ken Robinson says that we have, where we do break our society, or often judge our society, particularly in school and academia, according to those who are academic and non-academic. And I mentioned that notion of my brother, who's a general contractor, always saying to me, like, you're the smart one. The way we equate success often and intellect with academics. And Rachel's question, very, I think, appropriately, was, in pointing this out, she talks about her own experiences, but she also brings up this notion, the way in which this creates chaos, but then asks the question, what skills and interests, if any, have helped you in your education or life that you did not learn from a traditional school setting? I think learning how to go to school, for me, effectively, since that's been such a predominant atmosphere in my life, had a lot to do with, it didn't come from a book by any means, that's for sure. Learning how to go to school, and I mentioned a story about, me sort of challenging the class that I was in about, does everybody know this stuff? And then it was like, no, we're all figuring this out. So I think that's a very interesting question. Where do you learn things that we wouldn't consider learning normally, perhaps? And how can those things help you, not only in the educational sphere, but how can they also help you with your own projects, but also how can they just help you in your own lives? And I'm sure they already have. So this myth and death of the individual, which is obviously uncomfortable, right? Particularly in American society, we're big believers in American exceptionalism, right? Everybody's an individual on Facebook. I mean, I think that's why everybody says they're a little bit strange on Facebook, even though I don't have Facebook, but I'm just making assumptions. So I'm going to refer to that sheet of quotations that my cat is currently sitting on, that I provided that we didn't get a chance to get to. So the first quote I put on there was sort of about this notion of identity. Right, and Derrida makes this argument. Jacques Derrida, philosopher, French philosopher, theorist, makes an argument that quote, an identity is never given, received, or attained. Right, the assertion of identity always betrays a disorder of identity. So it isn't to say that there isn't such thing as an individual, or that there isn't such a thing as identity, but that these things are not as individualized, I guess you could say, as we think. Right, that we're sort of collecting our identities in some ways, right? I'm learning how to be, I'm learning things from my father, from my mother, my brother, my sister, my friends. I'm learning things from the things I read, from the movies I watch, the music I listen to. I'm learning things from everywhere, such that I become this almost kind of collaborative being. And this is something that Clapp sort of says is the way we should maybe start thinking about creativity. Right? I mean, we're in a capitalist society. We're so big about private property and ownership, right? And you think about how this is changing our economy. We're moving away from, one way to look at it is we're moving away from an individualized economy, big-time CEOs, big-time corporations. I mean, we have plenty of those still. But I mean, you think about things like Uber, car sharing, Airbnb, sharing our houses. People probably rent apartments far more than they do own things nowadays, and that's becoming more of a common trend, right? The American dream used to always be to own something, right? I can't wait to own my house, right? My piece of land. Well, I think that kind of aesthetic is changing. So Clapp says we can think about this in terms of creativity, and this is the second quote on the sheet. He says, in this sense, creativity can be said to be socially distributed, right? No one person is doing the creativity or being creative. Instead, all members of the team are participating in creativity. And each member's participation looks different. This is not to say that participation in group creativity is equally distributed. Indeed, on any given project, some individuals are likely to participate in creativity more than others, right? And I think that's an important thing to think about. We participate in different ways. Some people are very verbose. Some people will do a ton of online work. Some people are very quiet. Some people might sit in the corner. And that upsets a lot of people, right, in terms of group work. Like, well, I was doing all the work because I'm terrible at organization. Probably noticed already. So that's something to think about. So in that way, the individuality is more participatory. It's like styles. We have different styles. But the individual overall, right, is something that we need to get away from when it thinks about the way that we create, or the way that we begin to develop new ideas. This goes to the sort of third quote, right? Dalziel, Matthew Dalziel, who argues, quote, the most liberating thing is breaking away from the myth of the artist as that special, unique individual, the solitary Kafka-like personality working away on their own and in suffering. It's far more enjoyable to discuss ideas with someone who has also invested in the work. And that's something ideally that I got the most out of education, is being in a room full of people who are passionate about different things and are their own individuals, but they're passionate, right? They care about ideas, right? I mean, one of the things that Shakespeare said, I think it's Shakespeare said, that artists are thieves of fire. And I think what he meant by that is, in some ways, artists are ultimately plagiarizers, but in the sense of not just ripping somebody off word for word, but using other ideas to then create your own. So the myth of the individual, right, is something that I think it's about the way we think about individuality that's the problem, right? The fact that we don't recognize individuality and creativity as being something that is collaboratively produced. I mean, it's hard for me to say. If I create an artwork, it's usually a collection of all these other images, even unconsciously, that I've seen before. My influences. I mean, you see my room around me, all these books that are behind me that half of them maybe I've read, right? And whatever, movies I go to see, and whatever artists are around me, those are major influences. And that, I think, is something that we should celebrate. And of course, you should recognize it in your own work. One last thing on this sort of myth and death of the individual, and maybe we should put that in quotes, but it reminds me of Roland Barthes, right? I come from, part of my world is English literature, right? And Roland Barthes was a critical theorist who wrote an essay in 1967 called The Death of the Author. And his argument is that, particularly in the 60s, and up to that point, we would interpret literature according to the biography of the artist or the author, right? So it's like, well, we know that this person grew up in poverty, so all these books or all these poems that he or she wrote must be about poverty, right? And he argued against incorporating the intentions and the biographical context of the author when we interpret texts, right? To quote him, he says, quote, "To give a text an author is to impose a limit on the text," unquote. Now, obviously a very controversial saying we should totally forget the author when we're reading, or the artist, or the architect when it comes to a building. But I think he did that as this kind of move to shake up people's ideas, right? To me, individuality is inevitable, right? Nobody knows what it's like to see the way that I see, or see the way that you see. Nobody knows how you feel. Nobody has access to that, right? And nobody is going to have the same combination of influences that you have. So for me, individuality is inevitable. And in that sense, it's a myth because of the way we think about individuality. One last thing on this. I know I'm taking a little while with this, but one last thing is Arthur Rimbaud, who, again, going from the literary world, right, is a poet, and talked a lot about this, right, in terms of being a poet. What does it mean to be a poet? So I wanted to read from this letter, and notice how he sort of, first of all, he wrote this letter, right, and this is from the 13th of May, 1871, in Charleville, France. And he's writing to his friend Georges Izambard. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there, right? And he's talking about George as a teacher, and it was standard to read poetry as a source, as personal expression, right? As a source of subjectivity. And you're probably still recognize that. Oh, that poet feels in that particular way, and da-da-da-da. So for Rimbaud, this upsets him, because he has a different idea of individuality and a purpose for poetry beyond personal expression. Perhaps a more collaborative idea of what poetry should do or how it should be in the world. So he says, quote, "Not to mention that your subjective poetry will always be terribly insipid." I mean, he's like pissed off, right? "One day I hope many other people hope the same thing, that I shall see the objective poetry in her principle. I shall see it more sincerely than you would. I shall be a worker." So it's interesting that he's talking about, I don't want to be some expressive poet. I want to be a worker. I want to be out there with the people. That is the idea that holds me back. When mad rage drives me towards the Battle of Paris, where so many workers are still dying as I write to you, work now, never, never, I'm on strike. Now here's the part where you start talking about the individual. He says, "Now I louse myself up as much as possible," meaning he screws himself up. He gets drunk, he does all kinds of drugs. "Why do I do this? I want to be a poet, and I'm working to make myself a seer. You will not understand it all, and I hardly know how to explain it to you. The point is to arrive at the unknown by the dissoluteness of all the senses. The sufferings are enormous, but one thing has to be strong, to be born a poet, and I recognize myself to be a poet. It is not my fault at all. It is wrong to say I think, one ought to say I am thought. Pardon the pun." Now here's the last thing. "I," as in the personal pronoun I, "is someone else. No matter for the wood that finds itself a violin, and scoff at the thoughtless who argue about something they completely ignore." So the interesting idea there for me is that Rimbaud emphasizes that his idea is desire not just to be this person of personal expression, right, but for his work to exist in the world and matter in the world. I think that's pretty profound. Um, it's just dawning upon me that I'm going to cross over the limit for you too. So I think I'll be able to cut this project up and edit it. So let me move on to the second thing. And the second thing has to do with diverse participation. Right? Chase brought up a great quote from the Sir Robinson article. Let me get to it. Right, and he quoted, he was talking about the great man theory that Clapp brings up. Right, and Chase quoted this passage. Not only does a great man approach to creativity exhibit a bias towards a narrow set of individual abilities, given the list of names above, it also suggests a gender bias towards men. Even creativity narratives that do celebrate the achievements of women and people of color have the potential to alienate young people due to the greater-than-thou genius status that is granted to creative individuals, right? So Chase's question was, my question is about how we should identify influential works and artists and their works in the future. Should we keep analyzing the same first-time writers, inventors, etc. again in the future, or do we try to understand those who have built around and improved upon their creations, meaning the people who came before them? And that gets at this idea that I was talking about a minute ago, which is this idea that we often think of. I mean, one test is this: try to name for me off the top of your head 5 great female painters, right? There's probably a pretty good chance you can name a few, but probably not 5 even. Now, if I asked you to name me 5 male painters, you'd probably be able to do it, or great male authors versus female authors. There's definitely been a bias. Part of this problem with this notion of individuality, or what Clapp is calling the great man approach, is that it excludes so many people of the female gender or feminine gender, and it also excludes people of color, usually. You look at the canon of English literature. Now, things have changed a little bit in recent years, but overall it's been something that's been definitely biased. So that's another thing, is thinking about, well, how do I change the way that, so fine, I'm going to get this one, perhaps often great man theory of whatever field I'm interested in from school, or even from my peers, but then make the effort to seek out those other collaborators, those other individuals, if you will, that aren't just the sort of white male writers or artists or geniuses. Right. And this is something that I think that Kristen brought up as well in her relation to the Clapp article, which I thought was a really interesting shift. Right. She quotes from Clapp, if we switch the focus of creativity from individuals to ideas, which I think is a cool idea, if you will, then we set up the opportunity for multiple people to participate in creativity in unique and varied ways. Here, ideas are viewed as social, not psychological, making creative idea development something all students can participate in, not something only a few students are or have. Right? And Kristen asked this great question: why do people pin creativity onto a single person when your environment shapes and influences you so much? Right? Our next module is going to be about notions of context, and thinking about, where are we coming from? Where do we get our influences? Where do we get our biases? Where do we get our ideas? And so this shift, again, sort of like the thing I was talking about with participation, the shift from an attention solely upon the individual to this notion of ideas, right? And I think that's what Chase's point was. Like, well, what would it be rather to study, and I think Chase brought up like studying classes about Herman Melville or studying classes about James Joyce. What it would mean if we just studied books that all dealt with, notions of family, right? An idea of family or notions of capitalism. This goes to a few more quotes that I had on that sheet. The third one being the fourth quote on the sheet, right, which is Clapp. First, I find it essential that we broaden our perspectives of what it means to participate in creativity, especially within schools, so that the widest array of young people may see themselves as creative participants in the world. Second, I believe it is essential that we break down the barriers to creative participation so that all students, regardless of race, class, or zip code, may be given the opportunity to live up to their full potential. So breaking down those barriers and broadening our perspectives, right, that's really what that death of the individual is about, and also this shift from creativity to a matter of ideas. The other quote was just a quote from Edwin Land, and it's kind of which is politeness is the poison of collaboration. And we talked a little bit about this idea that collaborations are always people working together happily hand in hand, or that there isn't conflict, or that there isn't this importance of difference, right? In some ways, you could think about how the great man theory, right, keeps everything sort of the same. Right? It avoids conflicts. It avoids the history of the way in which our country was founded on the oppression of Africans, African Americans, and other minorities. And at the same time, part of that oppression has been excluding their voices. Right? No, collaboration, perhaps ideas, are about the kind of tension and conflict in those things. So I'm just sort of formative thinking about those things, and I think that's an important thing to think about in your partnerships, is not just always getting along, as I talked about in class, right? But understanding that there's struggles and challenges and difficulties as you work through ideas, right? And that you're going to be taken out of your comfort zones. You're going to be taken out of like, whoa, that's not the way I was thinking about that thing. Well, understand that as a moment of value, right? Or perhaps as a moment of possibility. So diverse participation, that was the second concept. Let me go now to the third concept, which was a field of ideas, or ideas as practices. All right, so we've gone from the individual creativity to ideas, and now I want to think about ideas as being a practice or a field. I know that's kind of bizarre, but I think Mike brought it up when he talked about standardization in relation to the Ken Robinson video that we watched about changing education paradigms, right? And Mike said, if you're interested in the model of learning, you don't start from this production line mentality. It's essentially about conformity, and increasingly it's about that as you look at the growth of standardized testing and standardized curricula, and it's about standardization. Standardization, of course, is the converse in many ways, or the opposite, the antonym of diversity, right? So Mike asked, is standardization a productive and accurate way to measure children's intelligence and overall worth? Or does it resemble a more systemical, authoritative approach to benefit a small percentile of the student population? So when we think about ideas, or we think about intelligence, we think about creativity as something that's even measurable, right? Like an SAT score or an IQ test, right? When we're well aware that, if we go back to Derrida's notion of identity, and we even go think of Christian's comment about our environments and the way that our environments are often vastly different, and particularly if you're in a situation where, as our country has built it, where a lot of people of color have been victims of cycles of poverty, to no fault of their own, but through discriminatory sort of institutional practices, right? If I grew up going to excellent schools that were well funded and well resourced and had the best teachers, chances are, and practiced the SAT and I read all those materials and studied all those classes, had the resources to do so, I'm probably going to do better on the SAT than I am a person who didn't have access to those materials and classes and resources, right? So moving beyond that notion of standardization. And this kind of reminded me when I was looking at, and I thought this was great. Betty made this comment in the Strategies wiki about listening to she called it morning disco. And I love this idea. And this goes to that notion of a field, opening up a field, right? And Betty, I know you also mentioned sort of starting the day off with a meme, right? And it's almost like, for me, what that meant to me was like starting the day off with a sort of clean slate, right? Sort of opening up, like I'm just going to play a crazy song, silly song, a disco song, or I'm going to take a look at a meme, have a laugh. I mean, laughter in comedy has a wonderful way of sort of showing how the way in which we adhere to certain rules and the way we adhere to certain sort of unspoken rules in society is kind of ridiculous, right? So I like this idea of morning disco, and this also somebody wrote in the Strategy wiki about it listening to an entire album. And whoever that is, please go in and put your last name in parentheses after that post, because it wasn't identified. But listening to an entire album, which is sort of like, letting a whole space open up, right? Thinking of ideas as entering into certain spaces, right? So I thought that was really interesting. So this goes to another Clapp quote, which is on the sheet for me, and this actually might be a quote that we could put on the keywords. He says, creativity is a distributed process of idea development that takes place over time and incorporates the contributions of a diverse network of actors, each of whom uniquely participate in the development of ideas in various ways. So there's all this variability, a diversity or the development of ideas in various ways, uniquely participate, right? A diverse network of actors, a distributed process. So we have this idea of all these different things. So, Betty's disco moment, I think you can count as a participant in whatever creativity that she develops in that, or you develop, Betty, in that particular day. Or, in anywhere, or the album, right? Like I created this much thanks to listening to a lot of, Pink Floyd's The Wall or something. I don't know, right? This also goes to a Rumi quote, right? Quote, and this is on the sheet, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing there is a field, I'll meet you there. In other words, let's go to a place where we leave behind these rules. Let's go to a place where we can let go of those sort of things that are confining us. The great man theory, right? The idea of creativity as genius. Let's go to a place where we leave behind the kind of even sort of strict morals, right? Let's go to a place where we can be our own participants in an idea, right? So one last quote in relation to that. Actually, two more. One more. To go back to that death of the author that I brought up in relation to Barthes, Roland Barthes. Michel Foucault, who is another critical theorist, contemporary critical theorist, wrote an essay called What is an Author in 1969. And it's kind of he never mentions Barthes' text, but it's kind of an evolution. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a rejection of Barthes' idea. I think it's similar vein, interrogating the idea of the author. And he makes this argument that the author is just a function, or I'll just read the quote. The author is a certain functional principle by which, in our culture, one limits, excludes, and chooses. The author is therefore an ideological figure by which one marks the manner in which we fear the proliferation of meaning. So what he's doing there is he's saying that the author is part of a whole discursive formation. That if we're going to look at a text, the important thing is, yes, don't just look at the author, but look at the author as being centered around a whole set of historical circumstances, not just their own personal biography, but how that book got published, this sort of field of cultural production that Pierre Bourdieu has theorized about, right? That you got to think about, right? I watched the other day Beyonce's Lemonade visual album, right? And, you have stuff from right? New Orleans, you have stuff from, her being partially from New Orleans, or she's from Texas and Oklahoma. You have stuff from current artists. You have references to past blues artists. You have this whole arena of influences, and you have Serena Williams in there. You have, I'm sure all kinds of other people that I don't recognize, Jay-Z in there. So this idea of ideas as being these kind of fields, right? These spaces that are sort of that we enter into, right, and that we that happen within very diverse kind of places, and you curate that field in many ways, right? You set that up, like, hey, I'm going to surround myself with a certain scenario, or you just expose yourself to certain situations. Okay, that takes me to the fourth concept, so just two more concepts here. And the fourth one, I called it as not a mirror, but an incarnation, right? Or a building out, right? And this is thinking about how creativity and collaboration, right, and creating something, right, or an idea isn't merely just a representation or a product of one's world, right? In other words, that it isn't that act of self-expression, right? I'm going to express how I feel. Actually, what it is, it's enacting, if you will. It's creative. It builds something out, or thinking of it that way might be useful, right? So Monica brought this up actually in her in the Ken Robinson video about the divergent thinking, right? So Monica wrote that around 7 minutes, 43 seconds, Ken Robinson begins to talk about divergent thinking, describing it as the ability to see a lot of possible answers to a question, lots of ways to interpret a question, not just linear or convergent, etc. And Monica goes on to talk about how that notion of the word interpret, right, that to think is an interpretation, right? To think isn't just merely, one way of thinking is to deduce, like I'm going to deduce what this thing means, right? Another way of thinking is interpreting, thinking about possibilities. Like, well, why couldn't, right? There's a classic story of Marcel Duchamp, an artist, and he had left a coat hanger on the floor accidentally in his apartment. And somebody visited suddenly, and he opened the door, and they walked in, and they tripped over the coat hanger. They didn't fall or anything, they just tripped. And so Marcel Duchamp famously got out a nail and hammer and nailed the coat hanger to the floor and called it a trap. And that for me is divergent thinking. And that for me is creativity. It's not that, so most people are like, that's insane. Well, it's divergent, right? But it's thinking about, another way of thinking about different possibilities in relation to ideas and objects, right? So I might plan, like, hey, I'm going to, let's say I have this plan, let's say thinking about, let's say Heather Berzak's project, right? Or hi, Heather, I'm sorry. I don't really know how to talk to a computer as if I'm talking to you, so sorry. Think about Heather's project of thinking about doing, right, a kind of profile of somebody in New York City or wherever, right? And then, well, why couldn't it be a profile of somebody who's a slam poet? And why couldn't the profile also be, involve you doing a performance or whatever it might be? In other words, that instead of just holding on, we're talking about Kristen's book, having multiple, perhaps different pathways, making sure that you're open to sort of divergent ideas in relation to your project, like I have a set idea of what this thing's going to be, and not holding too tightly upon that. You might find during the process of what you're working on and whatever you're creating that your ideas shift. They go in a totally different, unexpected direction. And that's fine, right? I'm trying to think of, I know authors who talk about, who write novels and they start off thinking one thing. I know how this book's going to end, let's say, or I know I want this to happen. And then it turns into something totally different. Right? It's just the way they woke up one day and this character started doing this. I hear them, characters take lives of their own on, they often talk about, right? Suddenly, I don't know, the character just wanted to swim, across the lake. I don't know why. I didn't even have a lake in there, So being open to those things and that divergent thinking, I think, is important. And this goes to the Oscar Wilde quote. I love Oscar Wilde, by the way, a huge influence of mine, right? And this is quote number, I don't know, second to the bottom of the sheet. He says, "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life," which is interesting to think about, right? In terms of like that art, the what we create, right? And that's what I mean by it's an incarnation, right? In other words, that art actually teaches people how to live differently, right? So when people walk in and they see an abstract painting, a lot of people will be like, it's stupid. Like, it's just like paint splattered on a canvas. But you could also think about it as this. Well, this person's trying to find a different way that you could use a canvas, right? So for centuries, the canvas was used to paint portraits, of nude women, usually. So somebody finally came out and said, well, why don't I just use this canvas for something totally different? Or then people are like, well, this artist just threw a bunch of canvases on the floor and put footprints on them. Well, in some ways, that's divergent thinking. And that's where art can teach you a different way to live, right? Not merely just representing the world, right? Life imitating art. Excuse me. Art imitating life. Like, I'm just going to create a perfect picture of what the building across the street from me looks like. No, instead, I'm going to create an artwork that makes people see something they think they know in a totally different way, or in a slightly different way. So people wonder why Andy Warhol did, 1,000 screen prints of the Campbell soup can. Right, Campbell's soup can is I think the reason he chose it, this is just my speculating, the reason he chose it was because at that time, was one of the most familiar items in a person's house. Everybody knew a Campbell's tomato soup can. It was iconic, it was American, it was the most basic domestic object. It's important that it's a domestic object too, I'm not going to get into that. But if anybody screen printed before, every time you run a screen, there's going to be little defects, there's going to be little nicks, there's going to be little misprints, there's going to be different depths and layers and levels of ink that pour through the screen in different places. It's going to, some of the letters are going to come out sloppier than others, right? The color is going to be a little different each time. All those things. So Andy Warhol's looking at a Campbell soup can saying this is a mass-produced object that you can almost not tell the difference between one can and the next, just like your Starbucks coffee. Tastes almost exactly the same every day. Well, Andy Warhol said, I'm going to do this thing, and it's also a comment about how even if we think we're mass-producing objects, they're never actually completely exactly the same. And that's important, that kind of divergent thinking. So this made me think of a quote from Shakespeare, another quote from Shakespeare, who said that art is a mirror held up to nature, and that would seem to say the opposite of what I'm saying. But then I found a quote by Joseph Campbell, who's a literary theorist, literary critic, who said that, who made it. Actually, that quote is from Hamlet, by the way. But Campbell reinterprets that quote, and he says, Shakespeare said that art is a mirror held up to nature, and that's what it is. The nature, though, is your nature. And all of these wonderful poetic images of mythology are referring to something in you. So nature, not in terms of the natural world, but nature in terms of what you would say one's nature, right? Well, it's in her nature to do X, Y, Z. When your mind is trapped by the image out there so that you never make the reference to yourself, you have misread the image, right? So the thing that Hamlet doesn't realize is that it's him, right? It's his nature. The inner world is the world of your requirements and your energies and your structure and your possibilities that meets the outer world. And the outer world, so your possibilities. I think that's key, right? That's kind of crucial in this idea, right? It's a place where your possibilities meet the outer world. I think that's a really cool way of thinking about creativity. And individuality and all those things. I might have to put that up there. That might be pretty good in the keyword blog. You've got to keep both going. As Novalis said, so he quotes from Novalis, quote, the seat of the soul is where the inner and outer worlds meet. Which is a totally different idea of individuality, right? we think of an individuality as like, what's in you? What's particularly inside you? No, individuality, why don't we think about it as this point of contact between your energies and your structure and your possibilities with this whole circumstance and context of the outer world. And just to plug a little bit, this goes to that sort of Heilker and Vandenberg quote on the sheet, right? And they're talking about writing studies. What is it? What is writing studies, right? And they say, in the case for writing studies as major discipline, Charles Bozeman argues that the study of writing is the study of, quote, how people come to take on thought, practice, perspective, and orientation of various ways of life, how they integrate or keep distinct those perspectives in which they are practiced, and how we organize our modern way of life economically, intellectually, socially, interpersonally, managerially, and politically through the medium of texts. Right? You've probably heard people talk about text not just being as written alphabetic text, but a text. A film is a text. In some ways, a building is a text. Your room, the world around us, nature, as in the natural world, is a kind of text to be read, interpreted, digested, spit back out. Right? So in many ways, that idea of not thinking of art or ideas or creations as mirrors, but as these exchanges, these collaborations, these incarnations, right? So that's the fourth thing. Finally, the fifth thing, and this video may never reach you guys because I don't know how I'm going to break this up. I'm going to have to break this up into at least 5 parts, I imagine. So my apologies for that. The fifth thing is I had you write a plan for your project, right? That was the first post to our exchange, right? I gave you a kind of worksheet, not kind of a worksheet, I gave you a worksheet, and it got me in going through the exchanges and looking at what people were planning. This was the fifth thing I was thinking about, that plans, rather than beings, particularly in light of all the stuff I've just said, and that you all have brought up and brought into my mind, a plan shouldn't just be simply like how I'm going to get from A to B. I think a plan should be more about a launching point into this sort of field of ideas, right? How do I launch myself, get myself out there? So I was even thinking about my strategy of listening to a certain book, or listening to the radio, or even just the process of research. If you think about it, the process of research is launching yourself into a particular field, a particular discourse, right? So, right, if I'm Chase and I'm thinking about doing, writing an article about films, about law, or entertainment law, or whatever it might be, lawsuits, or writing an article about the history of a certain period of film, one way to sort of launch myself is to enter that field, right? So I'm going to start reading articles about people who've written about that certain era of film. I'm going to start reading articles about people who I like who've written about films and how they write about films and how do they do that, right? So I'm going to start watching those films, I'm going to start, so I'm going to launch myself. So I think the plan isn't just, you shouldn't feel beholden to it. You should feel like, what are the ways in which I'm going to continue to sort of launch myself into new ideas, continually push myself out in that field, broaden that field of ideas, right? So I think one of the key things, and I actually found this interesting in terms of what Emily, you were talking about in the strategies document, right? Emily was talking about planning, right, for teaching, right, developing these PowerPoints. But in many ways, those PowerPoints that you're talking about, I imagine, Emily, are ways in which that are triggers for you to talk about certain things, triggers into certain lessons. They're designed to get people, like your students, to think about things on their own, right? They're heuristics is what I like to call them, right? They're ways in which, heuristics, which means like something that makes you, that opens you up to thinking about something on your own, right? And Maura, you actually brought up the notion of routine and its value to you in your own life. that you have this routine of how you get up, and you also have this routine at night. And I think that's just as valuable. I mean, we were talking about always breaking routines is important, but in many ways that routine becomes a plan. In other words, it's not like you have this sort of foundation of the way you work or the way that you live, right? And that you get into that. I mean, that's what gets you in sort of rhythm, and that's what allows you to launch into whatever ideas. Like, I've taken care of the stuff I've taken care of. Right. I mean, it's as simple. Like, I mean, you can say it something like this. Like, it's hard for me to work if I know I haven't taken care of certain. I know the oven's on. It's hard for me to work if I haven't taken care of my responsibilities. That's a kind of plan. Setting up a situation in which I know I'm going to be able to free myself and open myself up to that sort of field of ideas. Right. And Jess, I mean, I was talking about research, and Jess, you mentioned in your plan, right, that you wanted to start off by just researching how people struggle in different ways. What are the struggles people have? What is out there already? What is going on? How do I and that's a way to sort of unmoor yourself, meaning sort of cut the ties and dive into this space in which you can start allowing ideas to sort of flow in and develop, get out into that field that Rumi is talking about. And this brings me to the sort of last quote on the sheet here by Nigel Cross. And I thought this was really interesting. And this goes back to that notion of induction, right? Or enactment or launching, right? What this means, this is Nigel Cross. What this means is that designing is not a search for the optimum solution to the given problem, but that it is an exploratory process, right? The creative designer interprets the design. There's that word interpret, by the way, that Monica was latching onto, right? If somebody comes to me a problem and I'm a designer, my job isn't to simply just deduce how can I solve that problem. No, I'm going to interpret. I'm going to think of all the possibilities of ways, the different ways, all the possible different, as many possible different ways as I can to fulfill my client's request. The creative designer interprets the design brief not as a specification for a solution, but as a starting point for a journey or of exploration. So that's what I want to think about our plans that we're writing. The designer sets off to explore, to discover something new, rather than to reach somewhere already known, or to return with yet another example of the already familiar. Right? So for me, that's the kind of what we hope our plans can do, and what I hope this class can do for us. Right? These different sort of activities we're doing. It's not about the product of creating, right? What that strategy document. Well, that'll be great. I'll have a Bible of things, so to speak, of all these strategies that I can use to be creative. Yeah, that's one thing, but it's more important about the whole process of creating that document and where it takes you, exploring, discovering. So that's what, so that's really the key. And that goes for all the sort of things that we're doing here, your project journals, your exchanges, the keyword archive, our class discussions, right? It's not about getting it right. It's just doing it, going through it, exploring, pushing yourself, taking those intellectual risks, right, that I've talked about. All right, that's probably enough. I swear to God, I came into this thinking, I'm just going to do like a 10, 15-minute video. And we're just about at 50 minutes. So this is just some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about yesterday. And so you can get it that how I want to give you as much as I can as you guys are already doing online. And I thought this is the best way for me to do this and reach all of you. Real quick, I just want to go over the things that are coming up. For starters, with your plans, one thing just to keep in mind is that we don't have anything due tonight. Tonight's Wednesday, Wednesday the 11th, I believe. Let me see. I can't even check. It's Wednesday the 12th. Sorry. We don't have anything due for tonight. I shifted the exchange reply for Thursday night. So you'll want to take a look at that. It's in modules, exchange reply 1. So for all those exchanges we do, you're also replying to a partner. But on the nights that we don't necessarily have any work, the thing to keep in mind is that you're always supposed to be working on your projects, right? Trying to make whatever progress, whatever, or regress, either way. Try and launch into some sort of field. So one thing, is thinking about, one of the things I highly recommend for a plan, if you don't know where to start, is just to start doing research, start seeing what's out there, right? So, Mike, right, if I'm thinking about designing a kind of syllabus for a class, I would start researching syllabi on the internet. I would take a look at classes that are offered around town. I would hit up former professors. Do you have any syllabi? I would look at writing exercises. Look for books about writing exercises. So they do that research. What is already out there, right? Christian, you're working on that book. I would go look for what kind of books are in there. Like I mentioned, like Fight Club seems to be a very sort of, it may be in the same vein. Emily, if you're thinking about doing the learning a language project, then I'd go out there and see what tools are already out there for helping you to learn that language. So research, I think, is key. Diving in, and that's something that can become a part of your project journal post, right? And that's due Friday night. Okay, so if you've revised your plan and you've already started some research and found some research, that's something you can put in your project journal post due Friday night. Other things that are upcoming, we have our second exchange post, I believe, on Sunday, and then the reply on Monday. Now, as far as the activities in preparation for Vice, I am posting an article. I'll post that article tonight that we're either going to read collaboratively or that you should have just annotated and read by the time we meet on Tuesday. I'm also going to post, and this has kind of been the holdup, we're trying to post an episode of the show Balls Deep. Dom is working on that. We thought we had the links figured out, but they didn't work. I tried them today. They didn't work. So he's currently trying to figure out how that's going to happen. As soon as it's figured out, I will get it to you. And the other thing that we'll probably have is just questions, right? Thinking about making sure you come to class on Tuesday with questions for Dom and, or reflections and questions about the show after watching the episode and what goes on and video production, movie, all those things. So that's it. Thank you guys for those of you who've made it this far and this long into this video. Thanks for sticking around. I hope this is useful. And I just wanted to give you as much of the discussion that all the things that you've been doing online, I wanted to sort of start to gather some of those things and provide you with sort of some reflections I have. So until next time, I'm probably going to do these each week. Until next time, which won't be till next week, make sure you keep up with what's happening in the online course. And I will see you on Tuesday, or I'll see you online, but I'll also see you on Tuesday where we'll meet with Vice. All right, take care.